He hadn't spoken to a soul in months until he found a woman in a torn wedding dress curled up beside his dead wife's rocking chair. Silas Creed was a man shattered by loss, living alone in a creaking farmhouse where time stood still and grief filled every room. One thunder-drenched night, he opened his barn door to find a barefoot bride asleep in the hay, bruised, silent, and still wearing her veil. What brought her there? And why did she make him believe in love again before the sun could rise? If stories of healing, second chances, and unexpected connections touch your heart, you're in the right place. Every tale here is crafted with care, made for those who still believe in love, no matter how broken the world seems. If that's you, we invite you to subscribe. Let's walk through these quiet storms together. Silas Creed had grown used to silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind, not the gentle hush of early morning light, or the muffled quiet of snow falling. No, this silence was thick and hollow all at once, the kind that clung to your skin like dust in a house no one had cleaned in years. It filled the rooms, crept into the corners, and echoed louder than any sound could. His farmhouse stood hunched, in the Tennessee hills, crooked and tired, and the world around it seemed to have forgotten it existed. Birds flew over it, never stopping. Roads curved away from it like even the asphalt knew sorrow lived there. He used to have a rhythm. Coffee at dawn, feed the chickens, talk to Mary, even after she couldn't talk back. Then coffee again at noon, always in her chipped mug. Then whiskey at night. Just a sip, just enough to keep the ghosts from getting too loud. But now, the chickens were gone, the coffee sometimes, the whiskey often. Mary's mug still sat on the windowsill above the sink, but it hadn't been washed in over a year. Silas didn't know why he left it there, only that he did. Like it might matter somehow, like she might need it when she came back, though he knew that made no sense. She had died slowly. That was the cruel part. He'd begged God to take her quick, even offered himself in exchange, but cancer didn't bargain. It just took. It took everything. It took the color from her cheeks, the light from her eyes. It took the strength from her voice until she couldn't even whisper his name. It took his sleep, his appetite, and eventually, it took her. He buried her under the elm tree she loved, the one where she used to read on Sunday afternoons with her feet swinging over the roots and her hair loose in the breeze. He hadn't spoken to a soul in months. The mail piled up. The phone rang once in a while, but he never answered. He'd disconnected the internet when the bill came due, and he didn't miss it. Nothing out there on the other side of those screens had anything to offer him. Not anymore. The porch creaked under his weight when he stepped out that night, just past midnight. The wind had a strange edge to it. Not sharp, not cold, just different. The stars blinked through a torn blanket of cloud, and the moon looked like it had been bitten into. Half a moon, half a man. The rocking chair sat still. That was what stopped him. It always rocked, always. Whether from wind or memory, he couldn't say. But that night, it didn't move. And the silence, his constant companion, felt disturbed. There was a vibration in it. A thrum in the earth, maybe. Or maybe in his bones. Then he heard it. A sound. Faint. It came again. Not the rustle of trees or the creak of old wood, but something else. Something alive. A sob. Small. Shivering. The kind that doesn't ask to be heard. The kind you try to bury inside yourself. He moved down the steps and toward the barn, the gravel crunching underfoot. The door was already cracked open. That struck him. He always closed it. Always. The animals were long gone, but habits like that stick around. His hand touched the edge of the door, fingers brushing against rough, splintered wood. Inside, The air smelled like dust and hay. The bulb hanging from the rafter cast a tired glow. His eyes adjusted. And there she was, curled against the hay bales, the veil still tangled in her hair. The lace of her dress torn across the bodice, mud streaking the hem. She looked like she'd run through a storm, or something worse. Her bouquet, clutched tight to her chest, had long since wilted. Petals drooped, soft and brown, a sad echo of joy. Her mascara had run in dark trails down her cheeks. She looked up when she heard him. Her eyes, startlingly blue, met his, and neither of them moved. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know where else to go." He didn't speak, just walked away, into the house. A few minutes later he came back with a blanket. It was old, soft with age, the one Mary had crocheted during her last Christmas. He draped it over the girl without a word and backed away. She wrapped it around herself tightly, then leaned back against the hay and closed her eyes again. He watched for a moment longer, then turned and left. In the morning, he found her sitting on the porch steps. The rocking chair rocked beside her, though there was no wind. She had the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, hair wild and tangled. The dress looked even worse in daylight, ripped, dirtied beyond repair. She was sipping coffee from Mary's mug. He didn't remember giving it to her. "You made this?" she asked, holding up the cup. He gave a short nod. "It's chipped." He sat beside her without responding. They looked out across the field together. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, softly, she said, "He left me at the altar. Said I wasn't worth the fight." He turned to her, just slightly. "My daddy begged him not to marry me. Said I come with too much baggage. Maybe they were right." He said nothing, only looked back to the field. The sky was overcast, the colors of the land muted. "Your wife," she said after a moment. "She's gone." It wasn't a question. He nodded again. "I'm Mara. Silas." She glanced at the chair as it creaked again. "Is she still here?" Mara asked. He didn't answer. He didn't know how to. The next day, Mara hadn't left. He expected her to. She had the look of someone who ran from things, but she stayed. She borrowed one of Mary's old dresses, without asking, but somehow it didn't feel like trespass. It fit her, in a strange way. Not perfectly, but honestly. Like she'd lived in someone else's skin before. She cooked eggs that morning. He hadn't eaten a hot breakfast in over a year. He watched her in the kitchen, barefoot, humming under her breath. The hum was off-key, a little cracked. It reminded him of Mary's singing, never quite right, but full of heart. That night they played cards at the table. Mara cheated. Silas pretended not to notice. When she laughed, he blinked, like the sound startled him. It was the first laughter in that house since Mary had passed. Dust danced in the overhead light, like something long buried had started to rise. She told him stories, about her hometown, about her runaway groom, about the motel she had planned to stay at but couldn't afford, about walking until her feet gave out, about following the sound of wind chimes into the valley and seeing his barn like a mirage. "Your porch light was on," she said. "It felt like an invitation." "Wasn't. I know." More nights passed. They didn't talk about the future or the past, not really. Just pieces, fragments, little truths wrapped in safer lies. But the silence between them began to soften. It stretched less cruelly. They cooked together, cleaned together. He taught her how to chop firewood. She fixed the porch railing he'd given up on. They shared space the way only wounded people could, carefully, respectfully. She never asked him to forget. He never asked her to stay. But neither of them brought up leaving again. Then came the morning she found the photo. It was tucked into a book on the living room shelf. Mary, younger, beaming beside Silas in a field of sunflowers. Mara didn't say anything. She just set the photo on the mantel, like it belonged there again. That night, she cried. Silas heard her through the walls. He didn't go to her. He just sat on the edge of his bed holding the other half of Mary's blanket, staring at the shadow on the wall. But the next morning, Mara looked lighter. "Would you do it again?" she asked over coffee. He frowned. "Love someone, even knowing how it ends?" He didn't answer right away. His hands curled around the warm mug. "Yes," he said finally. "I would." She smiled. "Me too." Later that day, she took the veil from the barn and washed it in the creek, hung it to dry on the clothesline. The lace fluttered in the wind like a white flag. Silas watched it from the porch, heart aching and unsure why. That night, the sky lit up with stars, more than he'd seen in years. Mara stood under them barefoot, her hair glowing silver in the moonlight. "You believe in signs?" she asked. "No." She looked at him. "I do." Then she stepped toward him, slow and uncertain. "If I asked you to marry me, tonight, before the dawn, what would you say?" He stared at her. "I know it's crazy, but I don't want to go back to who I was before, and I think, maybe, this place saved me." He didn't speak, just took her hand. "I don't have a dress anymore," she added. "You do," he said. "It's hanging on the line." "The veil." She laughed. They stood in the field as the stars shifted overhead. "No preacher, no witnesses, just two people choosing to try again." He said, "I vow to be your quiet place when the world gets too loud." She said, "I vow to never walk away just because I'm scared." And before the sun touched the barn roof, they kissed. The chair rocked again on the porch. But this time Silas didn't imagine it was Mary. He knew it was her blessing, and it was time to live again. She didn't speak for a long time, and Silas didn't push her. That was one thing grief had taught him. Some stories take time to rise to the surface. Like old bones under frozen ground, they needed warmth and stillness before they could be unearthed. She sat with the blanket tight around her, knuckles white from the grip. Her eyes flickered toward the barn doors now and then, as if she half expected someone to storm in. Silas sat on a wooden stool a few feet away, his elbows on his knees, the tin coffee cup balanced in his hands. The scent of earth and rainwater lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of hay and rust. The storm outside had lost its fury, now just a dull tapping on the barn's tin roof, like a nervous hand knocking gently at the door of the past. He'd made her the coffee without asking, black and strong. He hadn't touched milk or sugar since Mary died. He didn't think to ask if the woman liked it bitter. She took the cup with both hands, lifting it close to her face to let the heat breathe into her skin before taking a small sip. Her lips trembled, not from the temperature but from something deeper, something trembling in her spirit. "He left me at the altar," she said, voice low and dry. "Right there, in front of everyone. Said he couldn't love someone broken." The words hung in the barn like fog, heavy and slow to dissipate. Silas didn't move, didn't ask for more. He just sipped his own coffee and kept his gaze low. The pain in her voice didn't surprise him. He'd known grief intimately. It wore many faces. Sometimes it looked like a coffin. Other times it wore a wedding dress. She looked up at him after a long pause. "And you? You live here alone?" He nodded once. "Used to be two of us." Nothing more was needed. She didn't press and he didn't offer. But that silence between them, it shifted. It didn't feel empty anymore. It was shared, like the quiet after a long cry, when two people sit side by side without needing to explain the ache in their hearts. The woman introduced herself the next day. They were in the kitchen, the morning light barely brushing through the curtains. Silas had made toast and eggs, dry and overdone, but food nonetheless, and she'd accepted the plate with a tired smile. "I'm Mara," she said finally, softly. He nodded, folding the dish towel on the counter. "Silas," she chewed slowly, eyes not meeting his. "I walked for hours, days maybe. I don't remember how long. I just kept going. My phone died somewhere outside Pulaski. Didn't matter. No one was calling." Silas rinsed a pan and didn't respond. He didn't need to. She needed space to speak, and he knew not to crowd it. "I followed the sound of wind chimes," she said after a while. "That's how I found your barn. Isn't that strange? Like some little music note was saying, 'This way.'" He glanced toward the porch window where Mary's old wind chime hung. A gift from her sister. He hadn't heard it in months. "I think it was grace," Mara whispered. "Some kind of mercy." They sat on the porch that evening, side by side, the sky bruised with the colors of twilight. The rocking chair beside them moved slowly, back and forth, as if it too were listening. Mara pulled the blanket tighter around her, though the air was warm. Her shoulders were still tense, like she was bracing for a blow that hadn't come yet. Silas had seen that look before. He remembered it from hospital waiting rooms, from grief support groups he'd tried attending before deciding that silence was kinder than words. "You were married," she said suddenly. He didn't answer right. Away. Just stared out over the field. Then finally, he nodded. "She died?" Another nod. "I'm sorry." He looked down at his hands. "Me too." That was the first night Mara didn't cry. They found a rhythm over the next few days, though. Neither would call it comfort. Mara cleaned the barn without being asked. She dusted off the old tools and organized them by size. She found a hammer and nails and fixed the back steps where the wood had rotted. Silas watched her work, sometimes from the window, sometimes from the porch. She moved like someone trying to stitch herself back together with tasks. And he understood. That. The doing often helped more than the saying. He offered her one of Mary's old dresses, folded neatly in the closet for reasons he hadn't examined. Mara hesitated, fingertips brushing the soft cotton. "Is it okay?" she asked, eyes searching his face. He nodded. She wouldn't mind. Mara put it on and stepped barefoot into the field behind the house. The hem swayed with the grass, and for a moment, she looked like a ghost caught between worlds. Silas watched her from the steps, and for the first time in months, he felt something stir in him that wasn't pain. She started cooking too. Just small things at first. Scrambled eggs, cornbread, soup from a dusty can. Nothing fancy, but it filled the house with smells that weren't dust or mildew. One afternoon, she made peach cobbler using the fruit from the tree that hadn't borne good peaches since Mary died. Silas didn't say anything, but he ate 2 helpings. That night, the 2 of them sat on the porch again. Lightning bugs blinked in the field like shy stars. Mara had found an old radio in the attic and tuned it to some static-filled country station. The music was soft, distant, but it filled the spaces between them. "I was never meant to marry." "Him," Mara said suddenly. Silas glanced over. "I knew it. I knew it every time he pulled away when I cried. Every time he rolled his eyes at my stories. Every time he called me too much. But I loved him anyway. Isn't that dumb?" "No." She smiled at that. Not a happy smile, a sad one. The kind that knows the truth but hasn't forgiven itself for it. "I think I just didn't want to be alone," she said. "But I was anyway. Even when he was beside me." Silas shifted in his seat. "Being with the wrong person can be lonelier than being alone." Mara nodded. "You ever feel like you're just too broken to try again?" He didn't answer. She didn't expect him to. But the next morning, she found a small wildflower tucked into the handle of her coffee cup. He never admitted it was him, but she didn't need him to. They started walking together in the mornings, just down the long dirt road that split his land, past the old fence and the creek bed. They didn't speak much during those walks. Sometimes Mara would hum. Sometimes Silas would point out a hawk circling high above the trees. But mostly they just walked, step by step, not needing to explain why being near each other made the air feel less heavy. Then came the night she asked him to dance. The rain had returned, soft and steady, tapping at the windows. Mara stood barefoot. In the living room, one of Mary's old records spinning slowly on the turntable. "Come on," she said, holding out a hand. "Just one dance." Silas hesitated, but he rose. They moved slowly, awkwardly at first, like two people remembering how to be human. Her hand rested on his shoulder, his arm at her waist. The music was soft and scratchy. The world outside disappeared. For those few minutes, they weren't two broken people clinging to memories. They were just Silas and Mara, dancing in the quiet where grief had no voice. After the song ended, they didn't speak. Mara stepped away, wiped her eyes, and walked upstairs. Silas watched her go and didn't follow. But that night, he slept without waking. The days passed. The quiet between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of unspoken truths, of tentative kindness, of healing that didn't need permission. They didn't talk about the past often. They didn't need to. Their stories were written in how they moved, in the way they hesitated before reaching for something, in how they looked away when tears gathered too quickly. Then came the morning Mara found the picture frame. It had fallen behind the dresser, dusty and forgotten. The photo inside showed Silas and Mary, laughing in front of the barn, arms around each other like they were holding the world together. Mara wiped the dust with her sleeve and set it on the mantel. When Silas saw it, he didn't speak, just touched the frame and nodded once. That evening, Mara sat on the porch steps with her hands folded in her lap. "I've been thinking," she said, "about staying." Silas didn't respond. "I don't know for how long. Maybe just until the wind tells me to go, but this place is kind to me." He nodded. "You're kind to it." She looked at the horizon. "I was afraid you'd ask me to leave." "I was afraid you'd leave without saying goodbye." She smiled, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes but means more because of it. Not yet. That night, as the stars crept over the sky, and the wind moved the rocking chair gently back and forth, Silas said something he hadn't said in years. "Good night, Mara." And from the dark, she whispered back, "Good night, Silas." They didn't need to say the rest. By the time the sky turned a soft purple at the edge of the fields, Mara stood barefoot outside the barn, looking up at the stars. The air was cool and quiet, the kind of stillness that made your thoughts louder. She could feel the grass brushing, her ankles damp with the memory of rain and the faint breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers and old wood. Her wedding dress was still stained at the hem with dirt and dew, torn near the sleeve where she'd caught it on a fence post. But she wore it anyway, not because it meant something anymore, but because in a strange, poetic way, it meant everything now. It was the last piece of who she had been, and somehow also the first piece of who she was becoming. Silas watched her from the porch, mug in hand, the warmth from his coffee long gone. He'd been sitting there for a while, not doing anything, in particular, just watching her breathe, watching her stand, watching her exist like someone caught between worlds. He didn't know what he felt looking at her. Peace, maybe. Hope, perhaps. Fear, too. But beneath it all, there was something steadier, quieter and harder to define, a deep-rooted knowing that this moment mattered. "You could stay," he said. Quietly, voice cutting through the stillness like a gentle ripple. "Not for long. Just until you want to leave." She turned, surprised, not just by the words, but by how tenderly he spoke them. Her eyes met his across the yard, and in that moment, It felt like they had always known each other, like grief had written their names into the same sentence long before their paths ever crossed. "I don't have a ring," he added, almost embarrassed. "But I could say some words." Mara smiled, tears forming in her eyes, not out of sadness, not exactly. She wasn't sure what they were. Relief, surrender. That strange sense of something finally clicking into place after being scattered for so long. She took a small step forward. "Do I need to change out of this dress?" "No," he said, stepping off the porch, slowly closing the distance between them. "It's perfect." They stood in the field, surrounded by the whispering of wind in the trees, the chirp of crickets slowly quieting as the night made way for morning. The sky above them shifted from deep indigo to bruised violet, the kind of color that only lasted a few precious minutes before the gold of dawn swallowed it whole. They didn't need music. They didn't need vows scribbled on paper, or a preacher, to make it official. What they needed, what they gave each other, was something deeper. Permission. Trust. A fragile but fearless decision to believe in beginning again. He took her hands in his. They were cold, delicate. But she didn't pull away. "I vow," Silas said, his voice cracking like something breaking open after being sealed for too long, "to be your quiet place when the world gets loud." Mara breathed in sharply, blinking away tears. "I vow," she whispered, "to never walk away just because I'm scared." Their foreheads touched, their eyes closed, and before the sun touched the barn roof, they kissed. Not like a fairy tale kiss, not something sweeping or cinematic. It was soft, trembling, honest, like everything that had led to it. The pain, the loneliness, the silence, had all been necessary to make it feel real. Silas never asked why she had come. He didn't need to know the full story. He had learned to let go of needing answers. Sometimes people just arrive when your soul needs them most. And Mara never asked how he could love again. She understood enough from the way he looked at the old photograph of his wife still sitting on the mantel, or the way he touched the wind chime on the porch like it held a voice he missed. Love doesn't replace what was lost. It grows around. The days that followed didn't change in dramatic ways. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping changes to the land or house. But there were signs. Small, tender proofs that something sacred had begun to grow. Mara began keeping flowers in a mason jar by the sink. Not store-bought ones, but little blooms picked from the edge of the woods, wild and imperfect. She began writing again. Little poems scribbled on the backs of grocery lists, quotes she remembered from books she loved, dreams she hadn't said aloud. Silas found them sometimes, tucked into coat pockets or beside his mug, and he never moved them. He just read them and let them linger. They repaired the fence together, painted the kitchen walls. Cleared out the attic one afternoon, tossing away decades of things neither of them recognized, but also finding small treasures. Old letters, yellowed photos, a box of Mary's recipes written in neat, looping cursive. Mara cried quietly when she read the one for blackberry cobbler. Silas let her cry. Then he handed her a clean apron and said, "Let's give it a try." They burned it the first time. Too much sugar. But the second attempt wasn't so bad. Nights were soft. Sometimes spent on the porch, sometimes curled up on the old couch, sometimes just sitting in silence with their hands intertwined. When she woke from nightmares, and she still did sometimes, he didn't ask her to explain. He just sat beside her on the edge of the bed and waited until her breathing evened out again. "I dreamed I was back there," she said once, her voice small and scared. "At the altar." But this time no one showed up. Not him, not the guests, not even the sun. Silas didn't say anything, just reached out and touched her cheek. "You're not alone now," he whispered. "You don't ever have to be." She moved closer, resting her head against his shoulder. and they stayed like that until sleep returned. Seasons passed, though they stopped marking them. Time moved slower in that house. Sometimes it felt like it didn't move at all. There were days when grief came back like a storm, sudden and uninvited. But now there were 2 umbrellas instead of 1. They didn't try to fix each other. They just stood together until the rain passed. One morning, Mara woke early and stepped outside. The sun was just beginning to warm the tops of the trees. She walked out to the old rocking chair on the porch, the one that creaked sometimes on windless days, and sat down. For a long while she just rocked, back and forth, her fingers tracing the worn wood of the armrests. She spoke aloud, though no one was around to hear. "I hope you see us. I hope you know he's okay." The wind picked up, soft but certain, brushing her hair back from her face. She smiled. When Silas stepped outside a few minutes later, carrying 2 mugs of coffee, he found her there, barefoot, eyes to the sky, wedding dress folded over the back of the chair like a flag of surrender. He handed her a cup. "Morning." "Morning." They sat together without a word. Eventually, she leaned her head on his shoulder. "You ever think we're just 2 ghosts, haunting each other until we learned how to live again?" He nodded. "I think maybe we still are." And she laughed. That small, soft kind of laugh that heals the places no one else can see. They never threw a big ceremony, never mailed out invitations or signed papers downtown. There was no need. Their promises had already been made beneath a sky that witnessed everything. Their vows weren't sealed by law but by choice, renewed every day in the way they spoke gently, in the way they forgave quickly, in the way they chose to stay. Love had not come to them like it does in stories. It came wounded, wary, and without fanfare. It arrived in muddy feet and broken dresses, in empty porches and silent kitchens. But it stayed, and it grew, and it held. And when the wind moved the old rocking chair that morning, it felt less like goodbye, and more like blessing.